Good morning everybody. Thank you for coming along to listen to us tell you about our combined research. This is a joint research effort between Murdoch University, where I'm from, my name is Jennifer, and UWA. And today we're just going to give you an overview of our project, which has been concerned with estimating community values for the Kimberley coastline and marine environment. So some broad context where our project fits in. Our research is part of the Kimberley Science and Conservation Strategy, which is a multi-million-dollar investment by the state government into science research in the Kimberley region. The research projects are focused on marine parks that exist in the Kimberley region. So on this map here you can see some darker blue shading and some lighter blue shading. They correspond to state and Commonwealth marine parks. There are 26 projects that were funded under the strategy. 24 of these are biological, ecological related, and only 2 of them are socio-economic, one of them being ours, so we're very special. And our particular project was focused on human values and aspirations for the coastline and marine environment. So the Kimberley region, for those of you who may be not as familiar with it, it's very remote. It's in the far northwest of WA. It's relatively undeveloped. It's got a very small population that's sparsely distributed across a few main population centres. It is very iconic. It's a very popular tourism destination. It's got a lot of mineral resources, high potential for mining, oil and gas extraction, etc. It also has extremely high conservation values as a result of its location and the fact that it has been isolated. It's got a lot of remnant biodiversity that may have been encroached on in other areas. And it is a fantastic adventure playground. It's got superlative fishing, nature-based tourism opportunities, great for hiking, walking, diving, etc., and just amazing landscapes. But it's such a fascinating place with so many incredible opportunities there that there is a high degree of potential for conflict in management. So it's really important to understand the social and economic landscape of there to guide management into the future. Often we get posed with the question of why do we need to explore social factors? Why can't we just look at the ecological things? In a nutshell, if you do not have an understanding and some means of addressing socio-economic concerns, what research around the globe has shown is that the long-term success of your biological conservation measures, so for example the long-term success of a marine park, will be compromised if you do not pay attention to the human factors as well as the ecological factors. So we are very mindful of that. We know there's a whole bunch of new marine parks that have been put in place in the Kimberley, and we wanted to go in and find out what people's values for the area were and what their management preferences were. In doing this, we were very careful to gather data in a way that was spatially explicit. Often people do struggle with social data because sometimes it's seen as fuzzy, or people don't quite know how to integrate it with the more traditional ecological data sets. So by making this social data spatially explicit, it's able to be integrated with existing planning and management approaches, which are spatially based. So it's a way to effectively marry the two. What we did then, we had a 2-part online survey that ran last year from April to July. The first component involved getting people to map on the online survey using public participation GIS. So PPGIS is a standard method for gathering spatially explicit data on a range of planning concerns. So it's a way to get spatially explicit information on things such as values, management preferences and ecosystem services. And it's a really good way to access the local and place-based information that stakeholders hold. So it's the kind of information that you might not be able to get through other research methods. And the second component of the survey was a choice experiment, and that was the domain of UWA. And the choice experiment was used to assess trade-offs between both outcomes, management outcomes, as well as trade-offs between different sites along the Kimberley coast. So in the first part of the survey, the PPGIS mapping, we had, after answering a number of introductory or socio-demographic questions, people were greeted with a mapping screen that looked like this. And what it showed them was our entire study area, which stretched from the Northern Territory border all the way down to the southern end of 80 Mile Beach. So that's a distance of 13,000 kilometres. It's pretty big. We delineated our study area, trying to get people to focus on the coastline with that bright pink line. So we were aiming to get them to focus on talking about the coastline and the marine environment. And then in a number of tabs, we gave them some predefined place values and predefined management options with associated icons, and we asked them to drag and drop these icons onto locations across the coast where the value or the management preference held true for them. Given that it was such a big scale, we greeted people with this zoomed out screen so they could orientate themselves, and then we required them to zoom in to a level. 10 kilometres was the minimum mapping scale that we enforced, and this meant that 1 centimetre on the computer screen represented 1 kilometre on the ground. We required that they placed one marker at least, so they had to do a little bit of something before they moved on to the rest of the survey. We didn't give them an upper limit for how many markers they could place, so we did have one extremely committed person who placed 2,080 markers onto this map. So they were really into the research, which was good. And to help orientate people, obviously the Kimberley coastline, it's highly indented and it's very easy to get lost in, even if you know it intimately. So we had a number of layers that people could toggle on and off on this map to help orientate themselves, so things such as place names and photographs and names of conservation parks and key tourism locations. We put a really big effort into recruitment for this research. We wanted to engage with as many different stakeholder groups associated with the Kimberley coast as we possibly could. We ended up engaging with about 10 odd stakeholder groups. The majority of these were visitors to the Kimberley coast, either current or previous visitors, followed by Kimberley residents and local state and government employees and fellow researchers who are always good to call on to contribute to research, especially given that many of them are working in the Kimberley space. So this graph is just giving you an overview of the relative proportion of the different values that were mapped onto that online interface. The most common, or the most numerous values that people associated with the Kimberley coast and marine environment were biological or conservation values, scenic or aesthetic values, recreational fishing and Aboriginal culture. And there were a total of almost 14,000 value markers placed on the map. And together those values that I mentioned, in addition to wilderness and nature-based tourism, accounted for more than 70% of all the value markers placed. So there was a strong dominance, if you will, in those types of values for the coastline. So we took all of the raw mapping data, all of those little individual dots that people dragged and dropped onto the map, took that raw mapping data and created a set of point density maps. And these maps were just a way for us to readily interpret the areas of the greatest relative density of values and the greatest relative density of management preferences. So the point density maps were created through an extremely simplified, as I'm talking about it, process of gridding the data, counting the number of value or management preference markers that were located within each grid cell, and then converting that numerical value into a graphical representation. So areas that were shaded green had a lower density of value or preference markers, yellow to orange are more medium density, and any areas that are bright red are areas that are high density. So I'm going to just show you a few of the point density maps that we generated now, starting with, this is a point density map for biological and conservation value, which, as I mentioned, was the most numerous or the most populous value that was associated with the coastline, with almost 2,300 markers placed. So what we can interpret from this graph, this figure, is first of all that the entire coastline is valued for biological or conservation value. There is no part of the coastline that is not associated with this value. But there are a number of clearer hotspots evident, and these are the areas that are shaded in yellow for a medium density of this value, whereas the area around Broome and Roebuck Bay to the south here in the red and orange is an area that is of high density for biological and conservation value. For any of you who are familiar with the Kimberley and Broome and Roebuck Bay in particular, this won't be surprising. It's a Ramsar site of significance, and it's got amazing biodiversity values associated with the bay in particular. I just thought I'd contrast that biological conservation value, which was the most popular value mapped, with values relating to European heritage. As you can see, only 358 people mapped this value across the coastline. But it provides a nice contrast to the previous figure where the entire coastline was associated with the value. Here you can see there are areas which people are not associating with European heritage, but there are a far greater number of high density hotspots for this value. So people, a high degree of spatial concurrence, if you will, on where people are saying this is where there is European heritage. And luckily enough, most of the mapping data actually checks out with what we know about European heritage, so it's correlating to things such as World War II sites, historic shipwrecks, early graffiti in boab trees, and mission establishment, etc. So it's just a nice way to see, it's a good ground truthing of the data and a good comparison between a value that was mapped many times and a value that was mapped lesser times, showing the power of these kind of figures. I've only given you a snapshot of two, but what we can see from the rest of the point density figures relating to values is that the entire coast is valued for one value or another. There is no part of the coastline that is not valued by stakeholders. The most common hotspots for values were located around Broome and Roebuck Bay, and also the southern, western and northern Dampier Peninsula, which is just the extent of land jutting north of Broome. And these points are also the two most accessible areas of the Kimberley in general for tourists, so that's perhaps not as surprising. But other hotspots existed in the Buccaneer Archipelago, which is an extremely scenic area, very popular on joy flights and cruises, around Derby and Southern King Sound, and also far to the north in Columbaroo and Napier Broome Bay. Okay, I'll quickly whiz you through now the management preferences. So just repeating again, we asked people to place a number of management preferences onto the map where they held true. We had both a mix of management preferences representing both pro-conservation and pro-development preferences, so that people were not being biased towards one preference or another. We had a far lesser number of preferences mapped, so almost 14,000 value markers were placed. We had almost 5,400 management preference markers placed, so a far lesser number. What we can see though is that the greatest number of markers were placed relating to preferences to increase conservation, to have no oil and gas development, no commercial fishing, and to increase Aboriginal management. And together these preferences accounted for 85% of the preferences, and they are what we grouped or term pro-conservation preferences. The remainder of preferences are things that we subsequently termed pro-development preferences, and these are things such as the desire to add tourism services, improve facilities, improve access, and to allow commercial fishing, oil and gas development and new port development. So now for some point density maps for the management preferences. The preference to increase conservation was the most popular preference of all. Again, the entire coastline, people want to see increased conservation along the entire coastline. There are a number of medium density hotspots you can see there, located around Napier Broome Bay and Columbaroo, the Admiralty Gulf and Mitchell Plateau, the Prince Regent River and St George Basin, and also the Buccaneer Archipelago and Horizontal Falls. All of these are key tourism access points, and they're likely to be, of any of the sites around the Kimberley, they're perhaps more likely to be visited by people. And again, the Dampier Peninsula features highly, and Broome and Roebuck Bay is again a high density hotspot. The second map I'll present today is the preference to increase Aboriginal management. 528 people placed markers relating to this preference. Almost the entire coastline is associated with this preference. There is a little gap down towards the southern end of 80 Mile Beach. This map presents a slightly different picture. You can see that Broome and Roebuck Bay is still a hotspot, but it's of a more medium density, whereas previously it's been a high density area. The high density area now is focused on the northern Dampier Peninsula. This readily correlates to what we know on the ground. The Dampier Peninsula is one of the best places in Australia, and definitely Western Australia, to get an understanding of and interact with the history of Aboriginal culture, but also with contemporary Aboriginal culture. It's got award-winning Aboriginal tourism ventures, accommodation and tours there. So it's not surprising that people are perhaps more aware of the Aboriginal values in this area, and this may be reflected in their preference to increase management of the area. A summary in general then of what we learnt from our research about the management preference hotspots. Broome and Roebuck Bay and southern, western and northern Dampier Peninsula are pro-conservation hotspots, whereas pro-development hotspots, so things where people are happy to have commercial fishing, more access, more facilities, and happy to have oil and gas development and new ports, again, are in Broome and Roebuck Bay, the southern, western and northern Dampier Peninsula, Derby and southern King Sound, and Columbaroo and Napier Broome Bay. So just as a quick snapshot here, we can see that there is potential conflict that is going to exist between the pro-conservation and the pro-development views for Broome and Roebuck Bay and the southern, western and northern Dampier Peninsula.
Put this on. Okay, I'm just going to introduce the choice experiment that we did that went along with the PPGIS mapping research. Most of you here will be quite familiar with choice experiments, but I'll just review it for those that aren't. They reveal preferences by forcing people to make decisions and trade-offs. So we describe a possible outcome in terms of a level of attributes, and we present several possible outcomes with varying levels of attributes, and we ask them to choose which one do they prefer from the possible outcomes. And in this experiment, we ask them to choose their single most preferred option. In that way, it's a discrete choice experiment. In this research, we were particularly interested in understanding some of the spatial value in the landscape, which is, of course, interesting if you're doing any natural resource management or environmental economics choice experiment. Values are located in the landscape. Often we look at this in relation to where the respondent is in the landscape, like how far away they are from the value, and that's referred to as sort of a distance decay effect. And also the uniqueness of the location may have the value. So we may value beaches, or we may value one particular special beach. So we're trying to understand some of that value in the landscape. Here's a quick example of a spatially explicit choice experiment. There actually aren't that many in the literature. This one is for lakes. A variety of lakes were given as alternatives with improvement levels to the lake and a dollar amount, and they could choose their single most preferred option. So the attributes that we chose for this choice experiment were decided upon from previous research that Murdoch did in the Kimberley. They conducted interviews of stakeholders and people. Yep, Jenny did that. And so they came up with a list of values and management preferences that arrived from those interviews. They weren't predefined. We also chose our attributes to be sort of matching or corresponding to the PPGIS mapping categories, and also in consultation with Parks and Wildlife, because we were trying to make this experiment as policy relevant as possible. So our first attribute is the percentage of state waters as a sanctuary zone. So that's a no-take zone protected for conservation, biological conservation outcomes. Our second one is in recreational facilities, improvement of the general recreational facilities in the area, defined as low, medium or high, and we described those levels to the respondents. Thirdly, the number of additional Aboriginal ranges that would be working. Number 4 would be an option to increase coastal development, where yes would be, as you travelled through that area, you would see some modern development every day. And we defined that by showing this picture of the jetty at Wyndham to give some idea of what we were talking about by modern development, the level of development that might be. And finally, a personal cost, which would, the payment mechanism would be increased taxation. So for our choice experiment, the question was, do people care about where in the landscape these changes occur or these management? So we split the Kimberley, our study region, into 6 zones. And these zones were decided in consultation with planners and managers to try and make them as useful as possible. We used an availability design. So in each choice question, we only made 2 of these zones available for options, and I'll show you an example. So in this choice question, you can have outcomes in Dampier Peninsula, or you can have management outcomes in Buccaneer Archipelago, and the third option, option C, is a no management on the Kimberley Coast, which is effectively like a status quo option. Here's a different example, which made management available in the Buccaneer Archipelago or in the northern Kimberley. So we sampled the Kimberley population, or the Kimberley stakeholders, and also residents of Perth. For this choice experiment, we actually had a number of split samples, which showed different versions, single zones or whole Kimberley, but we won't, I won't talk about that today. We'll just have a look at the results from the 6-zone choice experiment with the Kimberley stakeholder. So the same people that went through and did the PPGIS mapping then came and did the 6-zone choice experiment. We used a random parameter logic model with this random parameter on the status quo to allow for some heterogeneity, preference heterogeneity. And we are just showing interactions between the zones and the attributes. So we're just asking, are there spatial differentiation in the zones for the attributes? This is our initial model. So this model has zone-specific attributes. We can see that cost is negative and significant at the top. For sanctuary, it's positive. People like sanctuary. And it's significantly different for each zone. So this is zone 1, 2, 3 to 6. And there's a map there, just to remind you. Ranges was positive, but people had the same value for ranges in all 6 zones. For improvement to recreation, or to keep recreation at medium, we found that was not significant in this model. Oh, I skipped one. For improvement to recreation high, it's negative and significantly different for sort of three regions, I guess, zone 1 and 2, zone 3 and 4, and zone 5 and 6. Coastal development was negative for nearly all the zones, and the strongest negative values were in zone 3 and 4, which is Dampier Peninsula and Buccaneer Archipelago. This is the willingness to pay estimations from the model I just showed in the last slide, to give you an idea of the values we're looking at. So for sanctuary zones, sanctuary area in zones 1 and 2, about $3.60, and they're similar. 3 and 4 is a similar amount, almost double and significant. Sanctuary in zone 5 is different, and 6. For recreation high, we've got that variation between the southern, northern and middle zones. For improvement to recreation high, we've got that variation between the southern, northern and middle zones. and for development as well, a similar kind of pattern, and also in development, for coastal development in Zone 5, which is Campton Sound, we've got a not significant value, which we're still trying to figure out what's going on exactly in that zone. So this 6-zone model shows that all of our attributes are valued, and there are quite a lot of spatial differentiation in the attributes, most particularly related to the marine sanctuary zones, which was specific for each. It had a different value for each of the zones. Also, some sort of patterns in the anti-development and recreation in those zones 3 and 4, and differentiation between the southern zones and the northern zones. Also, as a side note, in a separate analysis, we found that respondents who had completed the PPGIS mapping and then went on to do the choice experiment had a higher willingness to pay overall than those who just went straight through and did the choice experiment. So we've got a lot of further analysis to do, but I'll pass on now to Marit, who's going to talk a little bit about how these methodologies combine and some conclusions.
Thanks, Leah. And thanks, Jenny. So it's up to me to finish on time. And I will bring the PPGIS component that you saw that Jenny presented and the choice experiment component that Alaya presented together, which we just finished writing up for the final report for our project. And we don't have any papers written yet, but that's what Alaya is going to work on for the next 3 months. So all we've done so far is just looking at how many markers have been mapped and how does that match to the values that we've estimated in the choice experiment. And I'm going to show you that analysis in graphs and figures. So first of all, we mapped of all the markers that are placed, all the value and preferences markers, where are those markers placed? So this can be any value, but it shows us, okay, where is the most focus of people spatially? And we overlaid the PPGIS, so all the marker maps with the choice experiment zones to decide, okay, where in which zone do those values occur. And you can see, you can see on this graph 2 types of 2 ways to present that data. One is the total number of values in that zone, and then the per kilometer value in that zone, because zones are quite different sizes. And that shows me that, okay, there is a lot of attention in terms of the markers placed on the Dampier Peninsula, which coincides with what Jenny showed, high density of markers, and also in the North Kimberley. But then keep in mind the North Kimberley is massive, truly massive, and then the per kilometer figure shows a little bit of a different picture with more attention to Roebuck Bay, which is where most respondents may be familiar with, and the Dampier Peninsula. So that's just mapping the proportion of markers onto the choice experiment zones. So when I then show those figures in maps, I'm going to show you a couple of different preferences that kind of map onto the choice experiment attributes. So in the PPGIS, we ask people to map their management preferences. More ports, less ports, more development, less development, and I'll match those to the choice experiment attributes. So starting with the recreational attribute. We had in the choice experiment low, medium, high recreational facility development, and what we saw in the choice experiment was that there weren't really any significant preferences for medium recreational development, but there was an aversion to high recreational development. When you look at the PPGIS map, you see a slightly different picture where I've put in adding recreational facilities. And you can see that there are some regions, in fact, where people would like to see some additional recreational facilities. The thing that does match very strongly to the choice experiment is that, yeah, there is not a high preference to add recreational facilities in the north. So you can start to see here how those two methods work really nicely together. This shows where people might want to add, and we show actually it's not just that they don't want to add, they actually want to avoid recreational facilities. You can also map very nicely potential areas of conflict that Jenny already mentioned. You had areas of high conservation value and areas where people said, oh, I wouldn't mind seeing some extra development. So I just wanted to put those two next to each other to show you those conflict areas. And this is these are the management preferences for adding additional port development, and I want to avoid extra port development. And you can see there's not that many people who would like to see more development. Maybe a little bit around Derby and Broome. There is, on the other hand, lots of people who don't want to see new port development, although they don't really mind in the first zone. And remember what we saw in the choice experiment. There was a large aversion, there was a negative willingness to pay for additional human development. And that willingness to pay to avoid development was largest in the Dampier Peninsula and the Buccaneer, our zones 3 and 4, those two. There was also a negative value here, and yeah, that matches broadly to what the PPGIS is telling us. I'll come back to that in a sec. So we have shown you, just very quickly, two methods to map spatially explicit values. With the PPGIS, people could place markers, and as many markers as they wanted, to show us where they value different attributes, if you want, in my language. And then you have the choice experiment, which kind of forces people to choose between regions and between attributes. And we think that combined, they provide a really rich data input for decision makers to show spatially along the coast where people would like to see more conservation and where they might not mind too much if there is some additional development. We also highlight very clearly areas where there's a conflict between conservation and development. And that might not be overly surprising if you know a bit of the history of the Kimberley. I asked this question in Adelaide, whether anyone had heard of James Price Point and the conflict around there. So I wonder how many people here have heard about James Price Point conflict? Oh, still way too low for... Okay, in Adelaide nobody knew. Anyway. We also show great support for marine parks development or for additional sanctuary area. And particularly, remember the choice experiment values, those willingness to pay values were highest in the Dampier and the Buccaneer. Which is good for the Department of Parks and Wildlife because they are planning more marine protected areas in the region. And as a choice experiment modeler, I think the forcing people to make trade-offs is very powerful because you can't protect the whole coast, so maybe allowing for trade-offs will be able to show, okay, if we have to protect only a proportion, where should we focus our resources on? This is just a summary that Broome, Roebuck Bay, and the Dampier Peninsula are the key hotspots for the markers, and that there is a strong aversion to high recreational development and human development, especially in the northern areas. So to finish off, I wanted to give you a bit of insights into why I think that we might be seeing this pattern between this pattern of spatial differentiation between the regions. So first of all, you saw with the PPGIS that people put a lot of markers around Broome, Roebuck Bay and 80 Mile Beach. But then when we did the choice experiment, the willingness to pay values were not the highest in those areas. So I think that is because people place markers because they know the region. So it's well known, and that's why people place markers. Why do they not have as high values as other regions? That might be because those regions are already relatively developed compared to other regions. Then you saw these really high values for the zones 3 and 4. I explained that, and Jenny mentioned it a few times as well, because those Dampier Peninsula and the Buccaneer are hotspots for tourism excursions. So people probably know those regions, and they know those regions as untouched wilderness, and they want to keep it that way. That's why we saw those high willingness to pay values for those regions. Now, the furthest north, we have Camden Sound and the northern Kimberley. And you saw that those regions were valued as well in terms of the markets placed, but willingness to pay was lower than the Dampier and the Buccaneer. And I think that might be because people simply don't know that much about it. It's also very remote. It's probably more untouched wilderness than the other two zones, but what you don't know, you might not value as much. And there's lots more analysis to do on this data. We want to look at respondent characteristics and their values and their PPGIS mapping behavior and the values. And we also want to look at whether we have different stakeholder groups in the data set. And not me, Alaya, included a nice photo of the whole team who has helped on the project. So today here we have Halina. You can ask her any questions on the PPGIS. Jenny, Alaya, and myself, and Sue Moore is the leader of the project at Murdoch. And then we all miss Michael. And Greg is the PPGIS guru at University of Queensland. And I actually don't know who that is. Joanna Pierce. Okay, Joanna Pierce.